All right. Thank you, ladies, so much for entertaining us with all the new things that are happening at the association and giving us a little bit of a rundown. Our next speaker is actually a panel of speakers, and we're very excited to have all these guys here with us. They probably combined have more knowledge than I could ever hope to have on the Wagyu business. So I'm going to turn it over to Jerry, and he can introduce these guys. And we'll get a little bit more on the history of Wagyu and hopefully some good advice on where we should be headed.
Thank you. Welcome to American Wagyu History 101. Not sure that I can guarantee we were there. I'm not sure we can remember everything that you're going to ask us. First, I'd like to introduce Buck Wright. Buck's to my right here. Him and his brother Raymond were the American opposite of the Kaneyama family that brought in the first new genetics in Michifuku, Haruki, Susatani, Okatani, and Rikitani. He was responsible for getting the permits, taking care of the cattle, and they also brought in a second import of these cattle. Buck also served as president of the Wagyu Association. I'm not sure exactly when, 1999. He was responsible for rewriting the rule book, or even probably writing the rule book. So he's got a lot of information about bringing these cattle in that I'm sure none of you have even heard about. Next, we got Shane Lindsay. Shane did his mission in Japan, speaks fluent Japanese, was with AgriBeef, set up the Snake River program, the meats program there. He then worked with David Blackmore in Australia and helping get their meats program going. He then set up Mishima Reserve, him and his brothers. He then sold Mishima Reserve, and he presently works for Myers Premium Beef, setting up the Curl Wagyu program. He's been in meat business for a long time. Doesn't look that old, but he's been around. Last, we got Charlie Gaskins. Charlie and I were on the faculty together at Washington State University, and Charlie started the first progeny test on the Wagyu in 1994. This was a time when the old genetics and the new genetics were both here, and he did studies evaluating the differences in marbling and carcass traits between those animals. Charlie also, the Wagyu Association went through some tough times. Basically, they didn't have any money, period. Charlie not only did the progeny test, quite a few, up until 2017, did progeny test on 100 different Wagyu bulls with 4,000 carcasses, real data. He also contributed his time as the executive director of the Wagyu Association for 10 years for no compensation. So, that's why university professors don't have much money. They work for nothing. But I believe you'll find all four of these individuals, or three, really quite interesting. I'll give a little more about the Wagyu. The first Wagyu to come in were in 1975 by the four bulls. These bulls, Mazda, Fuji, Rusha, and Judo, were brought in by Morris Whitney in 75. And Morris brought these bulls in to sell Wagyu meat to the American public. There was also a fifth bull that came into Canada in semen, Itohana VII, which came in for a research project, and part of that semen was found by Jack Ball. So these bulls were in the United States in the 70s. Japan was to take off their quotas and tariffs on meat going into Japan in 1991. Our university sent three of us there. Buck's brother Ray was one, Ray Gisome and myself, to kind of evaluate the market to see how we would develop an export market for Wagyu. And the Japanese at that time could only produce 1/3 of the meat that they needed. And so that opened the market for the rest, which was Australia, New Zealand, US, and Canada went after that market. And so we came back, like most ugly Americans, we thought our USDA choice meat was the best in the world, and all of a sudden saw a quality that we'd never seen before, and came back with a recommendation we should bring some more of these genetics in. In fact, we didn't even know the old genetics were in here at that time. We soon found that out, but basically came back, and we had a Speaker of the House of Washington, D.C. It was Tom Foley, and he was out of Spokane, and was a friend of WSU, and so things fell in line, and Buck will talk more about this, that we were lucky to get permission to bring these cattle in. And in fact, the United States was the only country that could get them in. Australia was trying very hard, but they didn't have the right connections. So I don't know what Tom Foley did, but as a politician that helped this breed quite a bit. So I'm going to stop there and let Buck start in, and we'll kind of go down the line here. Where's the clicker?
Below. Oh, there it is. I found it. Now we'll just find out how it works. What happens if I did that? Nothing. The big one? You got it, man. Jerry is a good friend of mine. I've known Jerry since I came to the Northwest back in the 80s. Jerry and I live about a half hour away from each other, and he stopped by, and I have had nothing to do with Wagyu for 35 years. Jerry pops in, he says, "Hey, Buck," he says, "I want you to do a presentation on the history of Wagyu." And I said, "You gotta be kidding me, Jerry. I haven't had anything to do with it for 35 years. But being his friend, I said, "You bet, Jerry, I'll do it." So that's why I'm here. And I'm thinking, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to do this. It's going to be part storytelling, part recognizing those people that you probably don't know, and how we were able to, with the help from politicians at DC, to cattlemen here, to WSU, Texas A&M, and how we were able to pull this thing off. I'm going to skip through this because Jerry said, "You know, Buck, you're kind of long-winded. I'm only going to give you 15 minutes, so I'm going to skip through some of these." Okay. I've been employed in the beef industry when I first got out of college, and that was back a long time ago. And I was a field representative for a major beef association, and part of this is my opinion, part of it's experience. And that is at that time in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, the focus was for cattle producers to maximize profits for themselves. The big four: birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, average daily gain. Calf weaned off to cow maintained. All these things that we were looking at was driven to ourselves to maximize profits and to lower inputs. I believe that we lost focus on the consumer. And so it wasn't until the National Beef Quality Audit came out that showed that 1 in 4 steaks was unsatisfactory, either for toughness or whatnot. The consumer wasn't happy. And so 67% of all the cattle killed back in the early 90s made choice. Of those, vast majority of them were low choice. At that time, 3 to 5% of all cattle made prime. And we knew that there were problems with what we were doing. We were too focused within ourselves to make money and didn't look at the people buying this thing. And so things began to change. And so I don't know how many of you either were in or are or share in the Angus Association, but I work for the white-face breed, and, we used to look, this is back in the 60s and 70s, of course, not in the 70s, but, little black cattle. But one thing, if you understood, the historical background of the Aberdeen, yes, Aberdeen Angus from Scotland, was in fact beef carcass qualities. And so none of the other breeds could say that. And the Angus Association took the plunge, and they came out with CAB, certified Angus beef. And if you ask the not normal, that's the wrong word, if you have the average consumer of beef, if you say Angus, they'll say quality. Now, that was a long road to hoe, and in fact, within the Breed Association, there was convincing to do that they were doing the right thing. And if you look out today and you see how many advertisements, how many labels, when they say Angus, they think quality. And they've won that race. Our first AWA executive director was Jim Scott from Shawnee Mission, Kansas. And Jim Scott, the times I met with Jim at conferences and whatnot was, we have to do what the Angus did. We have to turn around and take a generic product called beef and recognize it with quality, just like CAB did, and make the same thing in the Wagyu breed. So he basically said, imitate the Angus folks. They've got the right rubrics. They know what they're doing. If we were to succeed in this Wagyu thing with the attributes that they have in carcass merit, we have to take the same role model, take the same big picture that CAB people did, and do that with Wagyu. And I think Jim was right. Because when I see this product, my wife was at Costco, she goes, Buck, I'm going to take a picture of it. You won't believe what's in Costco right now. Now, wait a minute. I was told that, everything that ever hit the tallow bucket was a loss, right? Because there was a lot of energy that went in that cow's mouth, went in its gut, to put fat on that we don't need. And you people deserve a pat on your back to be able to take a jar of fat and sell it. So when you take, and Jerry mentioned about Morris Whitney. Morris Whitney was the one that, and I was at the conference, I was at every conference. Morris Whitney, Jim Scott convinced Morris Whitney to come out and tell his story. And it was heart-rending. It broke this man. He bankrupted over those 4 bulls. But I believe if I look back in a perspective that in fact, Morris Whitney was ahead of his time. It was just it was the right thing at the wrong time. And I think he would have been immensely successful had he come around 40 years later. I'd like to dedicate the rest of what I'm doing with a dedication to my brother, and you'll know why. This thing would not have happened if it wasn't for him. Okay, so why did all this happen? Well, it's like what's happening today, right? We're balancing trade. The U.S. has an abundance of ag products, and the Japanese had a lot of electronics, and there were lots of containers coming from Japan to the U.S. with cars and computers and, you name it, and nothing going back. And so in 91, they came up with this idea to help balance trade. And one of the things we have in abundance, ag products, and beef being one. So who are the guys behind that? Well, 2 of those gentlemen are right here with me, and the other one's my brother. So, and that's WSU, but one guy that tends to not hear a lot about, and that's David Lunt. And I owe a debt of gratitude to David Lunt, because when I came out, we came out, David Lunt was a presenter at Texas A&M to a bunch of Wagyu folks. Because you got to understand, the heart of the Wagyu thing at that time was Texas. Don Lively, Hildebrand, and so there was some research coming out of A&M, and K-State too, through Jim Scott. A lot of people forget about that too. David Lunt he bailed me out because there was a lot of people that weren't real happy about what we did because we just busted their market. And David turned around and he gave a tremendous presentation on my behalf, not my behalf, but to tell them, hey, this is the new genetics coming in, you ought to get on board. And David had a relationship in Japan with a small Wagyu producer that was feeding exclusively for certain restaurants. And they were using beer. And they would turn around and they would thought, well, get the cows drunk and they'd eat more, whatever. But no, when David turned around, he goes, really what the whole thing is about feeding beer to cows is because they're under total confinement for a very long amount of time, fed really slow, and their gut would shut down. And the microbes in the beer would stimulate their guts. And so David got to thinking with his grad students. He says, you know what? He says, he pointed a grad student, he says, you know what? I wonder if that alcohol has any influence on carcass characteristics. And he says, start looking into it. And he got a grad student that turned around, and David, thinking outside the box, he turns around and they got muscle tissue from known alcoholics, cadavers. And they turn around and use a Bradler shear force test, and you know what? It did affect muscle tissue. So that was one of the ones that didn't get printed very much. Okay, so there's the import protocol as we were confined to it. What it says is this. I'm just going to go through it pretty fast. What it says is you can turn around and import into the U.S. Japanese cattle, but you can't do embryos, you can't do semen. So we don't get to do the easy road. Excuse me. Anybody got a glass of water back here? Bring up here. Okay, here's the two guys. These are the gentlemen I work for. And it's Misoroshi Kanayama and Kenji Kawamoto. Mr. Kanayama owned a fine porcelain, like fine stuff made out of porcelain, right? Plates and dishes and stuff like that. And Kenji Kawamoto owned a restaurant, Wakamatsu restaurant in Japan. And it was like 3 or 4 stories. It was huge. Thank you. And they turned around and approached my brother after Jerry and Ray Jisome went to Japan, and with this idea that, hey, you know what? We'd like to turn around and see if we can find out if this protocol will work. We'll put up the money. And so the plan was, Shane could probably sympathize more or understand more about what I'm about to say. Kenji Kawamoto and Kanayama and Kawamoto were born and raised in Japan of Korean descent. And they were willing to take that risk as far as bringing these cattle in, and this is how they did it. They went through, after they came to agreement with Raymond to try this thing out, is that the idea, because they knew they were going to create a huge hornet's nest of doing this, because Wagyu cattle are a national treasure. They belong in Japan. They're a national pride. You can go through, for an example, and like at curio shops and stuff, like souvenirs, you see these little miniature cows. Cows are a big thing in Japan, a cultural thing. So anyway, what they thought was, we can turn around and I think we can get this done, but what we're going to do is we're going to go out and buy the cattle, and we're going to turn around and use the Wakamatsu restaurant as our front. We're buying these cattle because we're going to serve that beef in our restaurants. And that's what we did. And so a relationship between my brother, Kanayama and Kawamoto, began to develop. And through Jerry and Raymond and Ray Jisome, Ray began, and so did Jerry too, a relationship with Dr. Kiyoshi Namikawa. Dr. Namikawa was the executive director of the Wagyu registry, just like you people with this AWA. Dr. Namikawa ran the Japanese one. And him as Ray, because they were both, doctorates mean a big thing with Japan. And they formed a relationship, and I've spent a number of times with Dr. Namikawa. And so he became, when he knew, basically he had to be careful about, public relationships and all that stuff. He did assist us on the periphery of what we were doing, not the import itself, but about the pedigrees and stuff. He was okay to talk about that. but he was also instrumental for us being able to get that done, and he deserves recognition in this room. And in 1994, WSU put out a Wagyu synopsis thing after a deal, and I highly encourage Martha, whoever in charge of this magazine thing, to rerun that article that Dr. Namikawa gave to the U.S. to find out what the true history of the Wagyu breed is in Japan. I think it's very, very informative. Okay, so the cattle were purchased. One of them, somebody, when we were walking through the booth display deal, and a gentleman came up about, a name of a cow. And I says, no, it was Akatani, Rikitani, and Suzutani, and the bulls were Haruki-2 and Michifuku. That was the original name, and that's what they were. I know World's K now owns those genetics. They were the ones that ended up with it. But I know there's some name changes and stuff like that, but that's the 5 animals that came out. So we built a facility up in Hokkaido, up in the north end, way up there, and had the cattle. Once the barn was inspected, I can't go through because Jerry says, Buck, you can't go over 15 minutes. All the steps it took because no one else had done it. And so it was like you're under a microscope constantly. So you had 2 governments involved, Japanese and the U.S. U.S. represented by the USDA APHIS office, and Japan was the MAFF, and then we'll bring them up later. And so they had to come back, barn inspected about 2 or 3 times. And, oh, by the way, you're paying for their flight and their hotel rooms and all that stuff. When the cattle, it got the newspapers, and all hell broke loose. And Japanese were primarily concerned that if you took these genetics and crossed them with domestic cattle, which are in the millions compared to Japan, the average cow herd in Japan is 3 to 5 head. And they knew that if these genetics got out, they didn't even know about the original 4 bulls, that they were going to crush what they called their F1 market, which is freshening Holstein cows with Wagyu bulls, and that would cover their middle meats, their primes, high primes, and whatnot. And that's what they were truly concerned with, because with such a small import, they knew that the full-blood thing was protected. They were worried about the F1 market. And so hey, you know what? It's politics, right? So the Wagyu breeders, they get together, and it wasn't sanctioned by the association. Don't get me wrong. It was not the Japanese Wagyu Association that did this. This was a consortium of Wagyu breeders that got together, and they called themselves a commission. And they started flooding media, print, TV about stopping these big American cattle importers. They had no business. They're stealing our heritage. I mean, it got so bad, we needed help. Because the Japanese, Mr. Kawamoto, Mr. Kaneyama, says, Buck, we're getting killed. They're trying to stop us. And so the political pressure started mounting. Remember, these guys, Kawamoto and Kaneyama, are businessmen. They found out who their business was, and they began to attack them in the media and to boycott them. It was ugly. And they said, Mr. Buck, you got to do something. So, and then MAFF in response was dragging their feet with the import clause. In the meantime, you're making decisions way out there about bringing in, it's all in a timeline. The quarantine comes in, they come out, the USDA comes in and come out, you have paperwork, you got a plane, you're paying $10,000 per position, and if you miss that date, that doesn't make anything to the airline, you bought it. So we were under a huge amount of pressure. Jerry mentioned Tom Foley. Tom Foley is a House Speaker at that time, came from Washington State, understood it. I contacted Mr. Foley's office, and things started happening. And also, he ended up being the ambassador to Japan soon after that. And then also, I'm from Idaho, and Cease Andrus, which this is all fortuitous, right? He's good friends with Mickey Cantor. Who's Mickey Cantor? He was our trade representative at DC at that time. I mean, talk about all the stars lined up, right, just perfectly. Because when these guys started turning around, they sent me the copies of the letters that they sent to the ambassador of Japan, because politics, right, back and forth, back and forth. And it was pretty like get this done, and it did. Okay, and so it was fast forward, and now we're in a hotel room in Tokyo, and cattle coming in. The truck had left. Truck's on its way. We're in a hotel room, and cattle are going to load up that day or the next day. And Mr. Kaneyama pulls out this box with a video camera in. And I says, "What? What?" He goes, "This is a gift for you." I said, "Well, thanks." He says, and we had a secretary, Kage, and he says, "Why don't you and Kage go outside the hotel room and just, because all the buttons were in Japanese." So I thought, I don't know how to turn this thing on. So we turn around and kind of figure out on, off, play, all that stuff. And so I go, "What is this?" He says, "I want you to film everything tomorrow." I go, "Okay." He says, "Document everything." He says, "Because you know what? If they see us doing it, they'll stop us. You're the American. They won't stop you." And it was kind of fun because, here's a plane, at the cargo area and stuff, and you can just picture from about here to the back of that room was a chain link fence, and it was just lined up, NHK cameras, all being filmed. It was on that night's news. It was a big deal. So the cattle got out, went to New York. That's where they go and repeat quarantine all over again, is in New York, and then were released. The bulls went to Hawkeye, the females went to Transova. Okay, so a year or so goes by. Haruki 2 dies of a liver ailment. Not too long about Akatani dies at Transova with a twisted cecum. Now, you try and explain that to the investors. You're all cattlemen, right? You understand that cows die. Well, try and explain when about $250,000 went down the tubes. Yeah, it was a tough one. Okay, second import. So second import, we're starting to put some black cattle together. I'm running around doing marketing and all that stuff at conferences and whatnot. I'm approached by these two gentlemen, Bruce Hemmingson and Yukio Kurosawatsu. And they had some experience in dealing Holstein genetics to Japan. And they were working for or repping for Inglewood Farms. I believe it's Kennedy, Texas. And I knew Alan Murray Wood. I'd been there a couple different times. They go, "Hey, and I said, 'Hey, Bruce, I heard you bought a bunch of red cattle. You ready to come out?' And I never looked at the red cattle as like a marketing threat or anything like that because JVB had come in behind us. And so anyway, we still had the quarantine barn. He goes, we were having a few drinks, and he says, "Hey, Buck," he says, "I'm stuck. I bought all these cattle, and I can't get them out. I've tried everything. Can you help me?" I go, "Well, yeah, let me talk to the owners." So I talked to Mr. Kaneyama and Kawamoto, and they go, "Well," and so, trying to explain, I didn't see the black cattle, or the red cattle being a threat to black cattle. And anyway, make a long story short, we were able to settle it up, and so we brought the red genetics that you all now use, or some of you probably use, some red Akaushis, we brought those cattle out. Okay, so years go by, I'm about out of the Wagyu thing and on doing other stuff, and I was teaching, and so I applied and received a Fulbright scholarship to go to Japan, and that was 98. And I was over there for a while, and anyway, I was in Iwate Prefecture, which is up in Hokkaido. It's not in Hokkaido. It's kind of more rural. When you think of Japan, you think like Tokyo or something like that, or Osaka. Anyway, so one of the deals was a home visit with this gentleman who was an engineer, and he goes, "I've read your vitae," and he says, "You have an interest in Wagyu cattle," and I go, "Yes, sir." He says, "There happens to be a cow museum here in Iwate Prefecture, and I went ahead, and tomorrow we're going to blow it up, and the museum's closed, but I've got the director of the museum to meet with us, and you'll get a private tour." I said, "Hot dog." So the next morning we went to the museum. It's beautiful. If you're ever in Japan and you're ever in Iwate Prefecture, you ought to go see the cow museum. You can see it online, by the way. So anyway, we were going through there and opened the doors, did the bows and all that stuff. And on the walls were black and white photos of bulls. And Japanese, the pedigrees or whatever it was on there. And I had been studying semen catalogs, Wagyu, anything about Wagyu when I was involved in it. And I could recognize pictures of bulls, right? And so there's a bull there, and I go, oh, that's Yasumi Doi, that's Manjiro, that's Kitaguni. And he goes, you read Japanese? I go, nah, no. I said, and so I gave him kind of a short little dissertation about, what we had done. And he only said 2 words. That's impossible. That's the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Buck. We'll hold questions to the end because I'm not sure how long it's going to take. 15 minutes gets drug on pretty quick. Next, I got Shane. Would you take over?
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Sure. So I came into the equation a little bit just as all the work Buck had just mentioned was starting to conclude. I grew up in the cattle industry on a cow-calf operation, and frankly, most of my young life, I wanted to do nothing more than to get out of cattle and agriculture altogether. I ended up getting an opportunity to go to Japan. First was on a mission, and then later in college. And so from '88 to '93, all this is going on. I live in Japan, and I'm trying to learn Japanese and the culture, because at the time, if you remember, there was a lot of the trade surplus that Buck mentions going on, and there was all the flood of Toyotas and Sonys and everything coming to this country. They were buying up Pebble Beach and downtown Honolulu, and there was a little fear at that time that Japan might take us over, and kind of in this similar vein of way we think of China potentially today, of being this giant over there, that economic potential giant. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to learn that culture and learn that language and whatnot, and so that would be my ticket out of agriculture. And so I was over there from '88 to '93, and probably was on the same subway as Buck at one point, running around Tokyo. But as I concluded school, a lot of this, the liberation of the Japanese market for beef so that the U.S. exporters could freely export to Japan, a lot of that was just coming to fruition. There was a fellow in Idaho, Bob Rebholt Sr., who was kind of affiliated. I don't know what the relationship with Bob and this effort that Buck speaks of was at that juncture, but by 1993, Bob Rebholz was convinced that starting a Wagyu beef project to export to Japan was the right thing to do. It was a good move. He was just a feedlot owner in Pocatello, Idaho. Had grown a little bit beyond that at that point, but just still a feedlot operator essentially at that point. But he wanted to take the bull by the horns. Very innovative guy with a lot of skills. A Stanford graduate in finance. He had all the tools to see what was going on out in the future. He wanted to start a Wagyu beef project. And at the time, remember, the awareness level of the word Wagyu in this country was zero. There was not a single human in this country that was, other than this handful of folks here, unless you had been to Japan, which was rare at that time, that knew what the term Wagyu was. So this was exclusively an export-oriented project. And at that time, Bob Rebholz Sr. thought what he needed to get this off the ground was a Japanese-speaking cowboy to help him kind of get the know-how to feed and then go back over to Japan and sell the beef. And I was the only guy he could find that had the resume. I didn't find him. He found me. And my grandfather and he were associates, and my father worked part-time for him as a cattle buyer, etc. So there was a connection. He found me and brought me in. And it's evolved for over 30 years, but initially it was exclusively an export project. And now we've got this great tapestry of brands and what I was hired to help get started was the Snake River Farms brand, and that's the patriarch and the heavyweight champion of this niche. and was in the beginning and it still is. But we've got just a plethora. I mean, it's quite incredible the way this has evolved from zero awareness of this brand and this breed in this country to now a rich tapestry of available options for our consumers. We've got the Patriarch, Snake River Farms, and Imperial. Those are the volume leaders by a long shot. But we also have a handful of national players with good volume that have a presence in U.S. retail, like Mishima Reserve, Akaushi or Heart Brand, and then a whole slew of regional and specialty and niche players in your region, and you guys are a part of that in one capacity or another. And it's become a really nice, rich tapestry. But it did start as just a very simple, let's beat Japan at their own game and produce a product here in America that we can export to Japan to counter this trade imbalance. And this is how you do this, huh? But I would say, if you count 1995, all this activity Buck's talking about was, was it late 80s, very late 80s, very early 90s. And, while I was living in Japan. And then, so by the time those cattle got over here and it was able to become beef, it was 1995 before any type of commercial volume of beef was being produced and exported. And that's when I was, right in that time frame is when I was pulled in to help get a project started for Agri Beef Company. And it's been 25 years and it hasn't been an easy go, but I would say that this year, on a wholesale basis, that means from the producer of the animal to the first sale of that Wagyu beef, this year we will exceed $1 billion as an industry. So congratulations, you're part of a $1 billion industry now. And this graph here shows year over year, my estimations, there's no official data here, but I'm I guess as close as anyone can be to the numbers of cattle through different brands that are flowing into the beef world. And by my estimation this year, on a wholesale level, we'll sell $1 billion worth of product. And the red line there on this graph, by the way, represents Google searches for the term Wagyu. And of course, there was no Google in the first years of this, so you'll see it's at 0, but you'll also see it skyrocket. And I want to talk a little bit about these different phases of growth, just quickly. I won't take the full 15 minutes. But the first phase, up until that first yellow line where we hit $1 million, I see as the trailblazing era for this brand. And at the time, that most of those sales were exclusively into export markets. Well, at least for the first half of that. The first 2 years was exclusively Japan. And then we figured, well, they know a little bit about Wagyu in Hong Kong and in Taiwan and in Singapore. So we started selling to those markets as well. It wasn't until just before the mad cow incident down the road here in Mabton, the cow that killed Christmas, that we just before that we started even thinking of selling beef in the United States. I don't know why it didn't occur to us. We were basically selling ice to Eskimos. We were taking Wagyu beef and selling it all back to the one country on earth that had a surplus of Wagyu beef. But that was what we did, and I think it was really the cognizance that people in America have no idea what Wagyu beef is. How can we sell them something they're not even aware of? And just the lift of what it might, at that point, how heavy the lift would have been to educate the entire consumer base on what Wagyu beef was just seemed way too big. There's just no way we can do that. We got to sell this where people know it. And we did. And then we, like I said, step by step, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, where people were aware of the product, started selling there first. And then finally, we started meeting with people like Wolfgang Puck and Thomas Keller and some of these influencer type chefs and introducing the story to them. And, in that phase, we got some traction fairly quickly that people understood the niche. And so we thought we can make a run at this in the United States. And we also used the model of CAB to help us along. When we decided it was time to start selling this in the United States, the first thing we did was went to the CAB website. And fortunately for us, they had a list of all their customers right there for us. And so we just printed it off and started calling on these distributors that sold CAB And we figured if they were innovative enough and forward-thinking enough to want to sell a premium beef item, the first of its kind, they'd also probably be inclined to want to sell something that goes over the top of that. And so that's what we did next. We just followed in CAB's footprints as best we could and attacked the same distributors that sold their beef and the same chefs that promoted their beef and kind of one-upped them, I suppose, if you want to say it that way. In that next phase, you know, post-2007, once we had a little bit of notoriety and a little bit of momentum, it was still quite vulnerable. I would say, but before we got to that phase, somewhere in that trailblazing era, there were several junctures where our future wasn't for sure as an industry and as a niche. I recall a couple of different instances in the early 2000s when Agri Beef Company nearly shut down the Snake River Farms project, and that would have changed the trajectory of a lot of things for a lot of people. But it was not on solid footing for the first, I'd say, 10 to 12 years. It was, you know, getting by and building, telling the story over and over and over again. And we just repeatedly told people what Wagyu is. It's the breed behind Kobe beef. And fortunately for us, there was a small amount of recognition of the term Kobe beef in this country, which we kind of leveraged initially. We since kind of course corrected, but in that kind of second era where we were big enough to need to go sell more and we needed to tell the story in a much simpler way, we coined the term American style Kobe beef. And we just figured Wagyu was too foreign still, but people did know the term Kobe beef. And so we'd call it American style Kobe beef for a period of time. It was kind of a means to an end, I guess. We figured a better way to do it later, but it was a shortcut to telling the story, to use a brand that people were familiar with. In fact, I don't know if R.L. Freeborn here, I don't see him, but he had a company at that time that was called Kobe Beef America. So we did get into a little trouble and hot water and alienated some folks by calling it that in that period because it was plagiarism, you know, essentially, because Kobe is a brand of beef and it was trademark infringement. And we didn't mean to, we were pretty clear it was an American version of what they had produced over there, but technically it was not the correct thing to do. But we did course correct and coined the term American Wagyu beef, and that's how we know it today. In the second era, between 100 million and 500 million in sales, you know, that was when we had those issues with the finding out who we are. And finally, I think what we realized is we're not trying to be Japanese A5 Wagyu beef and failing, that we're producing something that's unique. And I got it here. You can see here that, you know, that's a picture of a U.S. prime steak and an A5 Wagyu steak side by side. And there's a pretty giant gap between those two. And, you know, instead of looking at it as an industry, what we're trying to do here is create a one-for-one replacement for the A5. We realize that that's a giant gap in quality and in quality, not really, richness level is the way I like to say it. And we can create a spectrum of quality levels and richness levels and price points between that. And that's when we've kind of figured what our American Wagyu beef identity was, is somewhere in that mid-2000s range, and coined the term American Wagyu beef and owned the idea that we're not A5 and we're not trying to be a replacement for Japanese A5. We're bridging the gap between prime and A5 with a spectrum of qualities and price points for the consumer of all kinds. And then, you know, once we started to tell that story enough times, things just kind of converged, and we reached a tipping point. And with social media and other outlets and YouTube and cooking channels on YouTube, etc., the need to have something new and interesting to talk about grew, and people latched onto the Wagyu name, and we saw just a huge uptick of notoriety and awareness. I think an antidote to that is, you know, from 1995 to probably 2014, 15, if anybody asked me that I didn't know what I did for a living, I'd have a really hard time getting across to them what it is I do. You know, I produce Wagyu cattle and Wagyu beef, and they, you know, just a blank stare. They didn't know what it was. But ever since maybe 2014, 15, if I just say, hey, I'm in Wagyu beef, they light up and they know exactly what it is, what I'm talking about. So about that time, 2014, 15, we reached this tipping point of awareness. And now, you know, now after that 500 million mark in 2019 there, and especially with COVID hitting, you know, just the notoriety, the awareness level just skyrocketed, and we became mainstream. I'd say we're in the mainstream era for Wagyu right now. And I don't know exactly when it happened or what caused it. It was a convergence of a lot of forces, a lot of things that these guys did, and then the telling of the story and the promoting and the building of a customer base and a lot of publicity, and then the advent of social media and foodies, etc., just skyrocketed us. And now, we're in every reasonable steakhouse in this country carries a Wagyu item. I was at a steakhouse in my city a couple of weeks ago, and they had maybe 12 different steak items on their menu, and 7 of them were Wagyu. They had 2 Japanese, they had 3 American varieties, and a couple of Aussie cuts on their menu. We're in Walmart, we're in Costco with not only tallow, but with Wagyu beef. We're mainstream now. And we are in no way, and to relate it back to CAB and Angus again, we have firmly dismounted them at the top of the pyramid. We are firmly at the top of the pyramid, and when someone wants a quality steak, they're really not even thinking Angus anymore. If you want to impress your neighbors or your boss or whatever, you're going to go get a Wagyu steak for your barbecue, and not Angus. Angus it's just not there anymore on the top of the pyramid. We've taken their place. So we talked about that. You know, and there's a plethora of brands and a lot of options, and this is not meant to be an accurate depiction, but I just wanted to give you guys a sense of scale where that $1 billion as an industry comes from. We've got some really strong and great support by the brands that are in this country. Snake River Farms, like I said, the patriarch and the heavyweight champion of this whole thing, and what a great company to represent this category. In fact, I would say that I don't know if there's a brand of Wagyu beef, or not of Wagyu beef, of beef in the United States that has more recognition or is recognized as a top quality brand more than Snake River Farms. It may be in the world, honestly. That I may be living in a little bubble in a vacuum, but I can't think of a brand of beef that has gained more popularity, more notoriety, more awareness than Snake River Farms. And in fact, when I do have a conversation with somebody and they ask me what I do, and I say I'm in Wagyu, and they say, "Oh, Snake River Farms," and I go, "Well, yeah, originally, yes, but not anymore." But that's the name people know. And since then, Imperial, others have come on, and I've been a part of some of those. And there's a rich tapestry now of brands and niches within the niche that create a lot of consumer options in Wagyu, and I think it's going phenomenally. Yes, we have our hiccups. Yes, we have some down years. There's some things that we're still vulnerable, actually, as an industry, just on the supply chain side of having downturns and problems. But we've come a long, long, long way in, if you count Buck's portion of this, more than 30 years. But in the commercial side, for the last 30 years, we've come a long, long, long way. There's one more graph I want to show, and then I'll wrap it up. But this is a graph of the head count, and of course it follows that a graph like this that shows sales would have to have a cattle supply chain that would support it, and this graph basically shows that, but it breaks it down a little bit more by breed composition. And these are all Wagyu to some degree or another, but you can't see it in the back, but the red bar at the bottom is the full blood or percentage Wagyu. And that's of the cattle that and beef that's marketed as Wagyu in this country. We're talking less than 2%, or full blood. I would say even less than that, but probably maximum 2%. And then the blue bar is kind of the more traditional model for F1s, and that's the Wagyu crossed with a beef breed, usually Angus. And that has been the staple for this niche for quite a long time. But you'll see that maybe the real effect that we've had recently that's allowed us to reach the plateau or the levels that we're at now is the advent of the dairy cross. Back in 2008, I think Jerry may know more about sexed semen and when its advent was, but I believe it was in 2007 and 8 they kind of made it functioning. In 2012, it became commercially viable so that dairies didn't have to breed all of their cows to dairy animals to get enough replacements, and that freed up a lot of uteruses to be, bred to something else. And we've slipped in there and bred a lot of dairy cows now to Wagyu. In fact, my current brand is 100% dairy Wagyu crosses. And I think that's it's been a fantastic little innovation, not only to a nice multiplier for our ability to expand, because you don't need one bull for every 26 live births. It's kind of, with artificial insemination, it's pretty unlimited. And so that's perhaps, and you can see, I think, is also that the blue line is tailing off just a bit, that maybe the dairy cross, it's still growing, but I think the dairy cross is growing at a greater rate and taking up a bigger and bigger percent of the total output of our cattle supply. So anyway, in conclusion, I just want to reemphasize that, man, in 30 years, we went from an industry and a niche that had zero recognition in this country, zero awareness level, to something that's now firmly on the top of the pyramid for quality. And I don't think we're going anywhere. I think there's a bright future ahead. In the growth cycle of this brand, I'm not sure where we are for sure, if we're starting to mature or if we're still in a heavy growth phase. I kind of think it's the latter, that we're still in the growth phase of this product life cycle. But time will tell, and I think thanks to the work of these gentlemen here, a great foundation was laid, and we've taken it from there and built it into something pretty nice. But thank you for your time.
Thank you, Shane. And now I'd like Charlie Gaskins, Dr. Charlie Gaskins, will tell you a little bit about how the association evolved.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here. I spend a lot of time at these annual meetings, and it's great to see a lot of new faces and a few old faces. I'm going to talk, first of all, it's interesting to hear Buck because he's got all his crazy stories, and it was kind of a wild time and a lot of issues. I'm going to just talk more about the association and how it's kind of evolved. So, does this thing have a pointer? Okay. So, I want to kind of go down through this because these are important things for why Wagyu came to the U.S. And in 1988, Japan announced that it was going to reduce the tariff on beef. We all know about tariffs now. And so that was an incentive to try to sell more beef to Japan. So you can see it came down significantly from a pretty high amount. And that was the incentive for looking for products that we could export to Japan. American Wagyu Association Incorporated in Texas in 1990. I wasn't involved with the association much back then. And this slide has the purpose of the association. I'm not going to read that, but it's pretty obvious what the purpose was at the time. Okay, membership, and I can't read those, but in December of 91, what does that say, 83? October 45 of 92, and then in 93. So the association wasn't growing very much then. We were just in the initial stages of trying to get going. Charter members of the association, so Don Lively and Fred Hildebrand, they were using these Wagyus that were imported in 1975. Nobody really knew much about them. They were down in Georgetown, Texas. And so they are charter members along with Shirley and Arthur Wendt, Daphne and Luther Laubach, and Marie and Al Wood, who brought in the red Wagyu cattle. Emeritus members, I think we probably should add some to that, but anyway, I'm going to keep going here. So the AWA presidents are very important to the association. They put in a lot of effort, a lot of hard work. And so I think it's important to recognize those. And Ray Record was involved in most of these people were involved in the importation of cattle. And you can see the names of the people. There were a bunch of them in Texas. Then Scott Niels in Washington, Marcy Hammond in Oregon, Ken Briggs back in Texas. And then there's J.W. Buck Wright was president, along with R.L. Freeborn, and I want to talk a little bit more about R.L. Freeborn, John Marchie from Montana, Ken Tu from Oregon, Martin Anderson from Montana, Ralph Valdez from Washington, and Bob Estrin from New Mexico. Michael Godell, I saw him earlier, was president in 2012. Don Brown, I saw Jeremy, his son, a while ago. Grant Robinson from Kentucky. Ralph Valdez was mentioned before. Joe Hoy from Iowa. Weldon Mahan from Texas. Pete Eshelman from Indiana. Kyle Journey from Texas. Sheila Patinkin from Vermont, long way off, and from where we were most in those days, and then Cade Nichols. So we don't know who the president will be for 2026. Okay, another bunch of people that worked really hard for the association. It was Jim Scott was involved in the importations. Then they hired Trey Kirkpatrick, who was a young guy from Bryan, Texas. In 2000, the association was broke. And so we had a meeting in Dallas, and with the help of R.L. Freeborn, we moved the association, the office to Oregon, and then we hired Janine Diavola, who was a technician at Washington State University, and she did all of the registrations and that sort of thing. I did a lot of communication, and I signed the papers. I didn't, just as a formality. Then we hired Michael Beatty. Bob Estrin was significant in getting Michael. Michael was Australian and involved in Wagyu in Australia. Then George Owen, Robert Williams, and now Jerry Cassidy is the executive. I think we're calling him director now. Okay, we have a rule book, and Buck Wright was the guy that put all the effort into developing the original rule book, and I helped Buck a little bit with that. The latest revision of the rule book was in September of 2024. Oops. By the way, that is a pointer. Moved to Washington. So I mentioned this already. the AWA couldn't pay for an executive secretary. We were about ready to shut down. So Trey Kirkpatrick resigned, and the decision was to move the AWA to Washington. R.L. Freeborn was the president, and he played a huge role in this and kept the association going. And R.L.'s kind of a controversial character. Some of you know him. Likes to stir the pot a little bit, but he put his heart and soul into keeping this association going. And Janine D'Avila was a half-time person, worked half-time with records and also half-time at Washington State University. And probably one of the bigger mistakes that the association made was to quit requiring DNA parent verification for purebreds. But the problem was it was too expensive for the value of the cattle at the time. And so that was kind of a decision that we made. Michael Beatty, we had an office in Pullman, Washington, where Washington State University is, and then when Michael Beatty was hired, he moved it to Post Falls. And we hired Martha Patterson, and hi Martha. And she did a tremendous job to keep the association going. It's kind of a one-person show for quite a long time. Oops. This, I don't think this, did you mention the mad cow thing? I mentioned it, that's all. That's it. I think the mad cow thing had a huge impact on Wagyu because we were exporting product to Japan, and then all of a sudden we couldn't. I mean, just like shut the door. And so we had a lot of cattle that were on feed, a lot of cattle in process. We had to figure out what to do with them. And guys like Shane Lindsay and others, Snake River Farms, they figured out how to market this cattle and meat to the U.S. Let's see. Just trying to see if there's any important things. Does point out here that we did in 2014 or 2004, we started exporting beef back to Japan. Okay, another thing that came along, we figured out there were these recessive disorders. Now, the number of Wagyu cattle in the U.S. is relatively small if you just count the animals that were brought in here. The genetic base is small. And when you have a small genetic base and you have to breed those animals to each other, you get inbreeding, and it's an opportunity for the expression of recessive deleterious genes. And I'm not going to go through these, but there was a lot of discussion about what to do, and a lot of effort was put into identifying animals that had genetic recessives, and you know that you can have your animals tested for those. I'm not going to talk any more about that, but it's an important factor in the development of the Wagyu breed in the U.S. Parent verification for registration. So imported animals was done by using nose prints. And we had these pieces of paper, they put some ink on there, and they printed the nose, and then you could see what the one was in Japan, and you could see what the one was in the U.S. And then we started using blood types, and there's just a few blood types that you can look at to determine parent verification, but parent verification is an extremely important part of our association work. And then we switched to DNA microsatellite markers and single nucleotide polymorphisms. So this is an evolution of the way we do parent verification, and we get really good accuracy with this single nucleotide polymorphisms. Okay, here's an example of a blood type card, and I just want to put this up as a historical thing. It's a stage we went through. It's a good thing we went through it. record systems. Our record-keeping system back when I was working with the association a lot was adapted from the Brangus breed. We had our own little program we ran. Then we used ABRI from Australia and digital beef, and I haven't upgraded this, so we have a different system now. I should. Same? Okay. For the records, yeah. So one of the things that Jerry really pushed me to get involved with was EPDs. I'm a geneticist by trade, and I taught genetics and statistics at the university. And genetic improvement is a lot of statistics and collecting a lot of data. So we worked hard to try to get some progeny tests. Progeny tests are really important because when you compare two animals, there's a lot of things you need to do to make sure that those two animals get a fair shake in terms of the number of cows, the type of cows, the management system, and everything. So we did some small, relatively small progeny test. Oops, sorry. I don't know if I can go back or not. Okay, got it. We try to set these progeny tests up with reference sire. A reference sire is an animal that's used fairly widely, and it connects the genetics together so you can try to remove environmental factors from the EPDs. We were looking at marbling, back fat, ribeye area, and hot carcass weight. Those were the ones we tried to collect data on. Almost all the phenotypic data was from Wagyu sires mated to Angus females. So all of that data we had was F1s. Not all of the cows were Angus, but the biggest part of them. A lot of big ranches in Montana we used and other places as well. We published a sire summary in 2001, and then we published summaries after that whenever we got new data. And by the way, getting the data is not an easy process. A lot of it gets lost. You got to maintain animal identification throughout the process. The last summary was done in 2017. This is kind of, we put Michifuku on the front of all of our sire summaries. The last sire summary, we had 109 sires that we published with 4,066 progeny. And I think these were very valuable assets to the association because we were able to identify animals that were genetically superior for the traits that we were looking at. I think that's enough, Jerry. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. I might just take a moment. I know we're running over time, but to kind of summarize what I heard today, and I have to say I'm kind of biased. I picked this panel because I knew the story they're going to tell. And the story was that the Wagyu came into the United States as an export market, and it was developed on a half-blood market to Japan. Mad cow disease was probably the second best thing that ever happened to the Wagyu, in that it had to be sold in the U.S. And I don't know that this broke some companies. One of them was R.L. Freeborn's Kobe of America. Company like Masami, which hadn't been talked about, was owned entirely by Japanese, a packing plant in Klamath Falls, feedlot in Corning, California. They didn't even know how to make hamburger. And all of a sudden, their line, they had 3 years of cattle behind it. They had containers stuck in Tokyo, Oakland, had no idea what to do with their meat. I said, well, somehow the Japanese respect university professors better than anybody else, so that's why they called me. And I said, well, all I know to do is, the stuff you've got cut up, you better make hamburger out of it. I don't know how you're going to sell Japanese cuts to Americans. And I sent my son down there and bought a hamburger machine and started making hamburger. But basically, some of these companies were really put under fire. I think Snake River Farms was better prepared because they sold a lot of domestic meat. They knew what they were doing, how to go into the domestic market. And so again, this half-blood product brought about the term Wagyu, so people recognized it. There's nothing else. Before that, it was all Kobe beef, or you couldn't even explain, just like Shane said. And so this half-blood product become known as a superior product. I hear on TV now a wine, it's a Wagyu wine, it's a Wagyu cheese. The term Wagyu means it's the best. And it happened because of this half-blood market. So I'm not saying there's room for everybody in this. And it's what Shane showed. You're between A5 Japanese and Angus Prime. There's a lot of room in there, and there's a room for everybody. But I don't think as an association, that we want to downplay the half-blood product that we've got. The American consumer is eating it and believing in it. And so, anyway, Buck and Charlie are going to be leaving after lunch, I believe. So if you got questions for them and you want to get right after them, Shane and I believe, will be around the rest of the meeting. Shane, you going to be around the rest of the meeting? So you can look us up anytime. And so some of the things that were talked about today that are interesting in our booth, our booth, I've got the names of every member in 1992. Most of them are Texans, Cade. I don't know if you do that, but and I've got some of this old information that the membership and things like that. If data that if you stop by, I'll show it to you. So I know we're over time, but if there's some questions, we'll try to entertain them until Martha tells us to stop.
It's not a question, but I thought it was really interesting when Buck was talking about the secretary named Connie. And I think it would be interesting for you to tell about those second generation Manette or World K Genetics and how they got their names, like Downarudu and Kagi, where some of these people I know are using Kagi now.
Yeah, Japanese. Shane, I'm going to ask you to help a little bit. Kage means key, right, in Japanese? Yeah, key. So Kage was a secretary. He was my translator. And I told Kage, I says, if you screw this up, I says, you can really hurt me. So make sure you get it right when you translate it. From God's lips to your ears. Yeah, that was Kage. And Kage went on. The original imports were taken or came to the U.S. under New Era Genetics. And then there was some changes in Japan that went under Manette. And then in the end, I believe they're still around, aren't they? World's K at Australia. And last time I heard, Kage is still with World's K in Australia.
Michael, incidentally, Kage didn't show up very well in the progeny test of Charlie, so. Other questions? Well, thank you. We appreciate it.